Okay, so I want to really quickly go through this PowerPoint slides presentation. Basically, what this is it's going to explain to you a lot of the causes for the Great Recession and the Great Depression, but it's also going to go over how we historically have pulled ourselves out of economic decline. So as you're listening to this and looking at the slides, what I want you to try to do is take notes. But I particularly would like you to try to take notes in a T-chart or a Venn diagram so you can start comparing and contrasting these two events. So, what caused the Great Depression? So, over here on the left, we have some events that were directly responsible, really, for causing this economic decline. So, when we're thinking about the Great Depression, this is in the early 1930s, 1933. So prior to this, all this stuff that is happening, this is coming off of the tail end of like the Roaring Twenties, Great Gatsby. This is after World War I, where much of Europe is completely destroyed and facing a Great Depression over there. You can tell it was really bad because in Germany in particular, people were actually burning money because it was cheaper than buying firewood. So that's kind of what the world looks like at the time. So over here on the left, we see events and trends. The very first one that's listed in here says the average Americans were investing in stocks on the stock market with borrowed money. So what that is called buying on a margin. And the reason why that's a bad idea is because you're investing money with borrowed money. Okay. So the idea is originally when you go into the stock market, you could put $5 down on a stock. And if the stock goes down, you might lose some money. And when you sell the stocks, you might have only $2 instead. So you've lost $3. But if you're buying on a margin, that means that you're borrowing $5 from the bank, you're going and investing it in the stock market. And if for whatever reason your investments do poorly, now when you sell your stocks and you have $2, you still owe the bank the $3 that they originally loaned you. So that's kind of why it's a bad idea. And we'll see a little bit more through this why that just is really an awful idea and why you should never really buy on a margin, because it's kind of a high risk, high reward type of situation. So the next thing that also happens is that the stock market crashed from failed investments, domestic and abroad. So what this is talking about is basically the rest of the world economy is doing really poorly. So all of our investments in other businesses in other parts of the world start doing poorly. And also you want to think about domestically means at home. So we're looking at the fact that in the Midwest, people are starting to over farm and overproduce wheat, and that's dropping the value of wheat, and it's essentially making people lose money. So again, all of those things are leading to the stock market just crashing and tanking. And like I said yesterday, and on Monday, the stock market crashing is usually the first really real visual sign that we can tell that there's a depression about to happen or a recession. The next thing is decreased exports leading to devalued gold standards. So we talked a little bit about in the last two classes how we now, everything in the world, all currency is compared to the US dollar. So this is before that happened at the Bretton Woods conferences. And this is the reason why we came to the agreement that we did at the Bretton Woods conference, because exports are one of the easiest ways for a country to make money because you're not just cycling the money within your own borders. When you're selling things to other countries, you're bringing in money from other countries. So the fact that there's that huge depression happening overseas, and people aren't able to afford to buy American products, that starts to drop the value of our money. Then the last thing that hopefully looks very familiar is the fact that there were very poor agricultural practices and an overproduction of wheat, which obviously, as hopefully you guys understood from the documentary watched by Ken Burns, is that this overproduction of wheat, though cheap, proved to not be a very smart idea in terms of what Americans want to be buying. So they're producing all this wheat that nobody really wants. So it kind of just sits there and wastes money. So the reaction to a lot of these trends and events that caused the Great Depression is that there is absolute mass panic and suffering. And the one thing that economies don't do well with is panic because the economy is kind of hoping that people are acting the same way pretty consistently. That's how we can measure it and compare it and contrast it is that there's kind of a baseline of what we can expect. But if people aren't acting the way that we would normally expect them to, then the economy it kind of goes into dark water, so to speak, and it's harder to predict what is going to happen. So because of this mass panic, people then did what's called a run on the banks, which means that everybody and their brother shows up at the bank and tries to take all of their money out at once. Well, how banks work is that they actually only hold a portion of the money that you a portion of the money that you keep in the bank, and the rest of it they use to make investments. That's how banks make money. That's how people are able to afford to buy homes, is because the bank has loaned them money, and so on and so forth. But when everybody shows up and does what's called the run on the bank, then the bank essentially goes bankrupt because everybody is taking all of the money out that they use to make investments and make money. So it caused all these banks to fail. Then the other thing is, of course, you guys watched the whole documentary on it, which was the man-made environmental disaster of the Dust Bowl. So on top of all these economic sufferings, we're also getting this huge environmental disaster that is as well affecting the economy and agricultural businesses, but it's also just affecting whether or not people can even go outside, which is something I'm sure you guys are all familiar with. So that one, I hope you can make that connection to COVID a little bit there. The next thing is that there is mass unemployment. This is because businesses are starting to lose money. So again, wages is one of the biggest expenses for businesses. So people start laying off their workers. This is mass unemployment, a record of 30% unemployment. We currently have, I think, somewhere around 7% unemployment. Usually, if it gets worse than that, it's a sign of a recession or depression. So when you guys are looking at the news and stuff like that, unemployment is one of those numbers that you definitely want to look at in terms of figuring out what the health of the economy is. Then the next thing, again, a number that you should always be paying attention to is GDP, which is gross domestic products. And it basically measures how much wealth is in a country. So it measures how many imports we're getting. So stuff that's being bought from other countries, stuff that we're selling to other countries, and kind of practices of spending and stuff within the country. So GDP drops by half. And then just generally, the world economy is continuing this depression as a reaction to what happened not only in World War I, but a lot of the, we talked about booms and busts a lot. So the Industrial Revolution and the Progressive Era is a boom. So at this time in the early 1930s, we're starting to see that bust happening. All right, so how do we fix the depression? Well, at the time FDR was president, he was one of the longest reigning presidents. I think he had 3 terms, maybe 4. But he introduced this thing called the New Deal. And FDR is renowned for bringing in a lot of social programs, but these social programs that he brought in were largely responsible for the economic growth that we were and rebound that we were able to have. But the New Deal consists of what's called the 3 R's: relief, recovery, and reform. And so what that's talking about is the relief part is immediate, like what they can do right now. So this usually involves handing out money to people who need it. Recovery is kind of the idea of creating sort of new jobs and new ways for people to start making money again. And then the reform part is referring to basically how they addressed legislation to make sure that this sort of thing doesn't happen again. So for the relief, part of this is that FDR immediately announced that there was going to be a holiday, a bank holiday, so that the banks were shut down so they couldn't continue to have a run on the banks. So that, again, that's an example of that sort of immediate reaction to what the economy is telling us. The next thing is that they started closing failing banks and they started reopening the ones that hadn't failed yet by giving them some economic support. So it's basically saying, like, get rid of the ones that are already gone and focus on the ones that there's still some hope of saving. The next thing that they did is they gave federal relief money to people that needed it. So just literally cutting people a check. I'm sure many of you remember in the spring that your parents probably got a check from the government as sort of that immediate relief. And the idea behind that is that you want people to go out and immediately start spending that money, so that money goes back into the economy, so that people can start hiring again and things like that. The next thing that they did is created the CCC. I can't remember off the top of my head what that acronym means, but it's something core. And the idea behind this is that you're starting to create a lot of these programs, as you'll see in the Recovery Act too, of creating government-run programs that are designed at getting people to work. So what this is usually talking about is building roads, for instance, right? We always need more roads, especially in New England, and you need people to do the roads. So the government starts hiring more people, particularly unmarried men. So these are people that wouldn't normally, they don't have any other kind of economic or personal responsibilities otherwise. They start hiring these men to start doing work so they can start paying them. Again, with the idea that if they're being paid, then they're going to be going out and spending money in the economy. The next thing is, in the 3 R's, is recovery. So again, this is where we start seeing a lot of those programs that are designed at increasing opportunities for jobs and work and for money to be re-injected into the economy. So the first one is that we see the creation of the NRA or NIRA. This is not the gun NRA that you guys are probably familiar with, but this agency was responsible for creating new economic policy that was starting to look at things like buying on a margin and how stock investments work, and other sort of import-exports types of policy and things like that. The next thing we're looking at is the AAA. This is the Agricultural Agency. So what they did is they started paying farmers to stop farming wheat. And I know this sounds counterintuitive, but basically the idea is that part of the problem is what led to the Depression is that this overproduction of wheat, you're producing something that nobody wants. So you're wasting the time and energy and money on farming something that is essentially hurting the economy. So the AAA was responsible for basically trying to cut down the production of wheat, and they were paying farmers to essentially just like, please, whatever you do, don't farm any more wheat. Then the next thing is we've got homeowners loans. So again, this is the idea that the government is trying to make it easier for somebody to purchase a home, which in turn helps them start saving up wealth. And again, it's all about trying to get people to go out and spend money in the economy so it gets re-injected into the system. The next thing, and this kind of goes back to the CCC, is the idea that infrastructure building and expanding government jobs. So this is, the government is responsible for doing a lot of things, right? So they're the ones that maintain the roads, they maintain a lot of government buildings, and things like that. So if you can get people and hire them to start working on these jobs and expanding new government jobs by making like new departments and stuff like that, like the AAA and the NRA or NIRA, then you're starting to be able to pay people money, and it's starting to lower that unemployment, and it's starting to get people back out and start spending their wages. Then lastly is the reform, and I really want you to pay attention to this particularly, okay? So the Glass-Steagall Act was one of the first pieces of legislation that really reformed banking and fiscal practices and making requirements for investors, okay? So part of this is the idea that a lot of those buying practices that were happening on the stock market that led to the Great Depression, they kind of put a kibosh on that, and we're saying we can't do that anymore, guys. It's too risky. And as we can see, obviously from the reactions of the Great Depression, nobody wants to see that kind of economy again, because people are going without food, they're going out with heat. Children aren't being able to go to school and have the proper nutrition and so on and so forth. So that legislation is really looking at, how do we prevent the stock market and businesses from putting us at any further risk for that sort of economic decline again. The next thing is creation of Social Security. So for those of you that don't know, Social Security, everybody has a portion of their check taken out, and it goes into this program called Social Security. And that program, is there for people who cannot afford to work for whatever reason. So if you have a severe accident, then you might get a check from Social Security that helps make sure that you are able to at least, get enough money for the necessities. And again, this is putting money back into the economy because they're spending the money that they're getting on food and all those other things. But also, when you get older and you can't work anymore, Social Security provides you checks as well. Um, the next thing, and some of you probably remember this from your slides presentation on unions, is that the Wagner Act started protecting workers in unions so that a lot of the employers couldn't continue to do the sort of unsafe practices that they were before. But it also has a lot to do with the grounds in which somebody can fire somebody or let them go. So that obviously helped a lot as well in terms of having people retain their jobs instead of losing them. And then the last thing is that there were new farming regulations to kind of prevent something like the Dust Bowl from happening again. So looking at those farming practices. Okay, so those are the three R's rather. And part of the three R's and part of the New Deal is what was called the alphabet soup agencies. So we see a huge expansion of the federal government with lots of different new bureaus and administrations and departments and whatever that were aimed at starting to try to take care of a lot of these issues. And again, this is part of those programs to start hiring people and getting them to be working. So we can see over here, there you go, CCC, Civilian Conservation Corps. So that was aimed at obviously public works, public park projects, and things like that. We've got the creation of the National Labor Relations Board, the WPA, the U.S. Work Program, in which that's still a program I believe that's running today. So young people can go and get hired and they'll be sent all over the country to do work. U.S. Department of Agriculture, Department of Public Works. So that's like fresh and clean water and things like that. So all of these agencies, the alphabet soup agencies, came out of the New Deal as an attempt to expand the federal government and provide more jobs for workers, but also the bureaucratizing of our government and the expansion of the federal government is essentially giving more power to the federal government to start regulating a lot of these different aspects of our society to make sure that there's sort of safeguards to prevent something like a Great Depression happening again. All right. So what saved the American economy from a Great Depression? Basically, it's kind of a toss-up depending on who you go and look at and who you talk to. Some people would just say it was absolutely the New Deal programs that FDR introduced, and then some people will say no, it was just World War II. And the reason why people say World War II is because we entered the war, and because of that, you see this huge boom in industrial work for supplying the military. So I wouldn't say that war is a great business to go into, but in terms of the production of war materials and stuff like that, there's definitely a lot of money in it, and that greatly contributed to the rebound of the economy. But I would argue, and a lot of other economists would argue, that it was a combination of these two things together, so the New Deal programs and World War II with the increase of wartime production. Really, though, it's kind of hard to tell and go back and say, well, if we hadn't entered World War I, which would have been more important or more impactful. That's the thing that sucks about history is you can play the guessing game and you can say, well, maybe. But the reality is that these two things together was what brought us out of the Depression. All right, so we're going to take a quick little break because in order to understand the recession, you kind of need to understand how to buy a house. And this is very complicated, and I really encourage you to ask your parents about this. But I want to give you just a quick rundown of actually how Americans buy a house. So the very first thing you need to do is you need to have money for what's called a down payment. So upfront, what you're going to pay right off the bat. Okay. And this money, some people take out a loan for it, but some people have it saved up. And it's usually 15 to 30% of the total cost of the home that you're buying. Okay. This little tidbit, that first bullet point though, is why a majority of wealth in the US is privileged because most middle-class white families rely on their parents to actually help them with that down payment. Like me personally, right now, for a house, even a cheaper end house, I need to have something like $20,000 saved. And that's really, really hard to do. So a lot of people rely on their family, they rely on inherited wealth to be able to afford to buy a home. So that's the very first thing that you need to do. The next thing is you need to be approved for a mortgage by the bank. Okay. And in order to have that happen, basically what the bank does is they look at your income. So how much money you make total, and how much you would need to be paying each month in order to pay back this mortgage. And a mortgage is just a huge loan that you're getting for a house. So for a house, basically, they're only going to approve you for a mortgage if you have 30% of your income will be going to paying back for this mortgage. So you need to be able to take 30% of your paycheck out each month and pay it back to the mortgage to be able to be approved, essentially. So they kind of check and see if that's something that is within your ability. And the next thing that they'll do is they'll look at what's called an interest rate. So an interest rate is basically whenever you loan money, there's usually an interest rate attached to it. The federal government usually is responsible for looking at what the interest rate is and kind of controlling that generally. But an interest rate is basically if I loan one of you $5 and the interest rate is 5%, every day that you don't pay me back that $5, you owe me an extra 5% every day from that $5. Okay. So really, when you're looking at home buying, when you're all said and done and you've paid off your mortgage and you personally own your home completely, you usually have paid almost twice the amount of the original cost of the house after interest. So what you want to try to have is what's called a fixed interest rate, meaning it doesn't shift with the times. It's whatever the interest rate was when you bought the house, it stays that way for the rest of the time. And you want to have usually a fixed mortgage for 20 to 30 years. Okay, so it means that you're paying off your home in 20 to 30 years with interest. So yeah, that's basically how you buy a home. Some of you are probably not going to need that for a while, but I needed to explain this to you because one of the biggest reasons for the Great Recession in 2007 is this home buying bubble, this bubble in the give me a second. I need to figure out my brain. When you see a bubble, it means that if you're looking at this boom and bust cycle, it means that there's this huge expanding funneling of money that goes in to this particular market. And the market that we're talking about with recession is the home buying market. Okay. So if you're looking at your T-chart and you're doing your Venn diagram, this is where you're going to start comparing the events and trends of the Great Depression to the events and trends of the Great Recession. Housing bubble. There it is. That's the word that I was looking for. Okay. Anyways, so one of the very first things that we're looking at is if you go back to the Glass-Steagall Act, which was regulating banking and fiscal policy, those regulations were reduced in the early 2000s during the Bush presidency. So those regulations are reduced, they're pulled back, they're not as tight, and it really allows people to kind of being a little bit more risky on the stock market and with their investments. The next thing that we see is that housing loans are starting to be given to people that have no possible way of paying back the loans. Part of this is because that bubble that we're talking about is that more and more people were trying to buy homes. The banks were trying to get people into these homes. So at the very minimum, they're having somebody pay them. Okay. So, all these people are showing up to bank, they're asking for a home loan, and when the bank goes to look and basically see if that 30% of your wages can go into the monthly payment, they're kind of just ignoring that fact entirely and just giving people homes that they know these people can't afford to pay back. And one of these, this plays into this huge trend that was happening at the beginning of the 2000s called mortgage-backed securities, or MBSs. So the idea is that bankers and banks are taking a bunch of home loans and they're putting them together and they're selling them to investors. And originally, this doesn't sound like such a bad idea because the idea is that most people don't want to be homeless. Most people want to own a home. So usually people paying back their mortgages is a pretty fair bet. So if you take a bunch of these home loans together and you package them and you sell them off to an investor, that investor is pretty much counting on all that money being returned back to them plus the interest of the mortgage. But the problem with what was going on in the early 2000s with this housing bubble, so the cost of homes were rising and people are continuing to get loans that they shouldn't be getting, is that these MBSs start being packed with bad loans. So what I want you to try to think about is it's like an egg carton, right? So when you go to the store, it's a lot cheaper and you're usually saving money if you go and buy a carton of 12 eggs, right? And when you open up the carton, they're usually all pretty good and, everything's all dandy. The problem is if you have one broken egg, you've lost a little bit of money, but it's no big deal because it's just one egg. What was happening in the early 2000s, though, is that these banking investors were buying these MBSs that have all broken eggs. And not only is that investor taking on the cost and the debt of those homes, but it's also taking on the interest rates because you're buying somebody else's debt. So that's causing investors to just absolutely tank and lose all of their money. So the reaction to all these things, these events and trends on the left, is that banks and mortgage companies start to immediately go bankrupt because, again, they have all these MBSs that are bad and they have all this debt that they've just accrued. As a reaction to that, the stock market dropped, which creates even more losses for investors. People start losing their homes again because they're starting to default on their mortgages, meaning they can't pay it back. So the banks start seizing their homes again. And the confidence in the US economy drop, and people start fearing that there is a depression on the horizon. So again, like I said earlier, panic is never good for the economy because people start reacting in ways that we can't necessarily anticipate. And again, we see that unemployment rises. So what did we do? Well, there's two different administrations that we're looking at because, again, this is 2007, 2008. And a depression and a recession, it's not something that you bound back quickly. The goal is to have slow incremental recovery. Usually anything with speed, again, it's like the boom and bust system. The higher you go, the higher you fall. So constant recovery is always the aim. So we're looking at two different administrations, George W. Bush and the Obama administration. So during Bush's administration, he put out the first Economic Stimulus Act, which gave rebates, meaning you're giving back taxpayers their money, and it increased the amount of loans that people could take out. So this is kind of referring to what's called trickle-down economics, okay? And trickle-down economics, or Reaganomics, which was invented by the Reagan administration, is a pretty bad way of going about looking at the economy, because the idea is that you're giving more money back to the people at the top, the rich people, and that eventually they'll be encouraged to spend more money, and eventually it will get back to the middle class workers and stuff like that, people who have mom and pop shops. The problem is that doesn't actually work because the rich people, the top 1% or the top 10% that we're talking about, they have so much money that no matter how much money you give them as a tax cut, they're still not going to be able to spend enough. And they're also going back and taking that money and putting it back into investments on the stock market and so on and so forth. So it doesn't actually ever trickle down the average American. The Bush administration also did what was called the TARP Act, T-A-R-P, which allowed the government to start purchasing assets, meaning investments for failing companies to keep them afloat, okay? So they're going and bailing out $7 billion worth of companies. Some Some of you probably will remember that Wall Street and banks and all those other things in the Great Recession, there was a lot of protests. I don't even know how old you guys would be when this happened, but there were a lot of protests on Wall Street and stuff like that at the time because, um, you know, average Americans were sitting there going, these people at the top, these bankers and these investors, their practices are what led to the Depression. So why the heck are you helping them out and giving them money? So average Americans got pretty frustrated with that. Then during 2009, 2010 actually, right? No, 2012 would be when Obama took office. And when he entered the office of the president, he introduced the second stimulus package, which had new cuts and increased government spending on infrastructure projects, kind of like the same thing with the New Deal, healthcare, schools, and new renewable energy sources. So, as you can see with the Bush administration, their economic attempts was to help kind of the banking and the investing, whereas Obama's administration was really taking a page out of FDR's New Deal. And then also the Frank-Dodd Act was signed, which gave the federal government more control over the financial industry and banking practices. So really kind of reaffirming the regulations that they got rid of with the Glass-Steagall Act. So by 2016, when Obama is leaving office, the economy had completely recovered and was doing really well. And that trend led into the first year or two of Trump's presidency. So that's basically, I feel like I need to take a nap now or something. But basically, that is the cause and the causes and reactions to the Great Depression and the Great Recession, and basically how we were able to pull ourselves out of both of these economic declines. If you have any questions, I would like you to ask me them tomorrow at the very beginning of class, and you can write them down and as many questions as you like, because this is very complicated stuff. It's kind of hard to understand, and normally you guys would be sitting in front of me in a classroom and you'd just be able to say, whoa, Miss L, stop, walk back a couple feet and start over again. But you guys are just doing this with a screencast. So if you do have any questions, please make sure that you write them down and that you ask me tomorrow so that I can answer those. All right, guys, that's it for this one.